we are also on Facebook. Well, we're here at the Collector Hotel, which is in the heart of the federal electorate of Parramatta, which is proving to be one of the key battlegrounds in the upcoming federal election. This week's interest rate rise will impact borrowers, of course, around the country. But homeowners in areas like this will be feeling the squeeze more than most. Research from the University of New South Wales has found more than a third of mortgage holders in 8 Sydney marginal seats are facing financial stress. And the suburbs faring the worst are in Labor-held seats in Greater Western Sydney, Werriwa and Greenway. There are also signs that the mood might be shifting when it comes to how much people are willing to spend on a home, with auction clearance rates down in some of the major cities. Our reporter Stephanie Bolchi went to an auction in Revesby in Sydney's southwest to gauge buyer sentiment.
This part of Western Sydney, about a half an hour's drive from the Opera House, is becoming hot property.
Registration is taking place inside the kitchen. In order to bid, you have to be registered according to the legislation. If you don't want to bid, you don't have to bid.
The median house price in Revesby now sits at $1.3 million, up nearly 26% during the pandemic. That's according to property data experts CoreLogic. And for first home buyers, it's proving difficult.
Sewer to deliver to these dwellings. So what's happened is that same house and land package is now $1.1 to $1.2 million.
Wow.
So when we're looking, we've almost lost a generation, an opportunity, just because Sydney Water could not deliver sewer.
Right, but it also speaks to the point of you have to be conscious that it's not just about housing affordability, right? It's about building communities and maintaining communities.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's not just about putting a house and saying, well, you need to travel an hour and a half to get to work, or if you want to go watch a football game, you got to go spend another hour to get there. You know, how do we build communities? How do we build the new Australia? And that's what we have out in Liverpool. We have the new international airport that's being built. You know, we have a city centre, but we really need to focus as a country, as a collective, how do we build this new Australian, new communities? And it's not just something for us in Liverpool, it's everyone. It's relevant to everybody here.
Because you've got to make sure that you haven't just got the houses, you've got the sewage sorted out, there's enough green space, there's the right infrastructure and transport and so on. So you just bought a house relatively recently, I think, with your partner?
Congratulations.
Yes. And I understand you managed to extract a discount somehow.
No, I think we got really lucky. I know a lot of my friends, and a lot of them are still living at home with mum and dad trying to save for their first home deposit. So last year, my partner and I, we bought our first property together. It's not in the most desirable suburb in Sydney, and I think what made us really lucky was that there happened to be a burnt out stolen car at the front, and I think that scared a lot of people. Yeah, right. But I know that the struggle is real. I spent 3 years with my partner trying to buy our first home, and I almost gave up and resigned to the fact that I'd be a long-term renter. So we were fortunate to come across such a great deal, but it's not the same for everybody. And I know with increasing housing prices, people are really feeling the stress and the anxiety of perhaps never owning their own home.
I'm getting a mental picture of a lot of auctioneers sweating as they're pushing the carcasses of burnt out cars away from properties this weekend.
There'll be an outbreak of burnt out cars turning up in front of houses for auction starting next Saturday.
But you've been working for a long time to try this. I mean, it wasn't easy for you, right? And for 15 or 16 years? You've been working since you were 15 and you've been saving since then. What's the situation for your friends? How difficult are your peers finding it?
Well, I think the Australian dream of owning your own home isn't as attainable to everybody and to all Australians now. A lot of my friends have opted to downsize and live in apartment and purchase apartments instead of a house, a single dwelling. A lot of people too, and in the package we saw there were duplexes. A lot of people are also opting to live in granny flats. So I think we just have to make do, and the fact that our wages aren't increasing at the same rate as our cost of living has really impacted on people's lives. And when you're living paycheck to paycheck, it's very difficult to own your own home. And so I think whilst there's housing stress, there's also rental stress as well for people who can't even enter into the market.
Jan, Fran, it used to be a derogatory term to be a Westie.
Yeah.
And
excuse me, when was that? I've
it
never
was
heard
for a
that
brief
derogatory
period
term.
in 1972, I think May. People, you know, used to kind of like say that was not a desirable place, as desirable a place to live, as opposed to the fact that it's got communities, that it's got that are very strong, that it's very, you know, desirable housing and market. These kind of booming, diverse, economically kind of flourishing in many ways suburbs, right? Too.
Yeah, of course. I mean, speaking of the pandemic, I think living in southwest Sydney and being subject to really harsh lockdowns was just a really difficult time. And you know, every day that I left my home for my 1 hour of exercise, I would see the police. And this was constant for months. And I think it was more of a reflection really on the lack of empathy that our decision makers had with the communities, because they couldn't understand the people's lived experiences and why people had to leave their homes because they worked in jobs that they can't work from home. My partner was in that situation, and every day, you know, it was a risk to go out, but what choice did we have? And we live with our extended families, with mum and dad, with our grandparents. And so if one person gets infected, they come home. So the rate of infection in these areas skyrocketed. And so I think that communities really felt misunderstood and abandoned by the government during this time.
I want to come back to that question of being heard and being properly represented. But Peter, back to the housing situation. We have people there trying to buy homes, those who already have them, the immense mortgage stress. There's also rental stress as well. More than 50% of southwest Sydney homeowners in mortgage stress. I mean, the average house price is where we are, over $1 million. Do you think that either of the policies, of the tranche of policy being put forward by the major parties at this election will alleviate anxieties around this or the stress?
Well, if they alleviate the anxieties and stress, it'll be a false hope. The policies that both the major parties are putting forward at this election will not change the essentials of the problem. The essentials of the problem are that there's growing demand and supply doesn't keep up. You get lots of demand, not enough supply, what happens? The price goes up. It's just the slowness of building new supply. Ned's example earlier about the infrastructure problem, building sewers to a new housing estate, just one of many, many examples. So just in brief, the parties are bringing policies which are either marginal. So Labor, for example, is promising to build 30,000 new low and medium income homes. Okay, that's a useful contribution. But with 150, 160,000 people a year entering the market, it's obviously at the margin. It's not going to make a material difference, and it's not going to interrupt that longer term trajectory in house prices. And the government, all their policies are helping people with small deposits to get into the market for the first time. Again, they're increasing the demand, but not increasing the supply. So you've got more people chasing the same number of houses under the false illusion that somehow they're getting ahead. So these policies aren't real. Perhaps the most useful policy in the long run is Albanese saying that we will set up a new mechanism to talk to the states about housing supply, to try and coordinate with state governments, because states control land releases and the planning sort of decisions and the decisions that Ned was talking about. So if we can get the state and federal governments streamlining the processes, that would be great. But getting the state and federal governments to cooperate on anything, that's pretty tricky even before COVID.
But do you think, yeah.
Well, can I just say, sorry, it's this is a national crisis, and we need to get back to what we do best as Australians and have that attitude where we're having a go, the great Australian spirit, the spirit that we see when there's a national disaster on, whether it's a flood or a bushfire. We all get together and we solve problems and we make things happen. So we have to do things differently. This cooperation is definitely one part of it. But looking at why don't we look at other countries where they issue bonds that is used to fund infrastructure. You know, we're talking about some $20-30 billion, which you can go out there and put it across the country. We have plenty of land in Australia, right? But we're stuck with doing things the way that we always do them. Until we change that and say, well, let's work together. But then when we do that, then the question is, where is corporate Australia? You know, where is corporate Australia moving jobs out from Barangaroo in the middle of the city, right, and putting them into these communities? Where do we come build the sporting infrastructure with it as well and building community? So it's government has one part to play in it, but so does corporate Australia. Here we are in Parramatta, which has been an amazing story. Parramatta 10 years ago didn't have these towers. Now you've got light rail here about to open, you've got a brand new stadium, you have plenty of Australia's big ASX 200 companies focused right here, and this, anything should say to us, Western Sydney, and we can provide housing around employment, because that's a vital part of it. So I think we get that new thinking, then things won't change.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things that needs to be discussed when we're looking at housing in the long term, and just kind of expanding it outside of Western Sydney for a wee bit and kind of trying to make it as universal as possible, is the income to household cost ratio. So if you look at houses in 1981, for example, they cost an eye-watering $79,000, if you could believe that. Which was 5 times the national full-time average annual salary, right? If you fast forward to 2021, you've got houses that cost an average of $1.3 million. This is in Sydney. And that is 14 times the income of your average full-time earner, right? So there is this massive discrepancy happening between the wages that we're earning and the money that we are spending on housing. And I think if we really want to tackle that, well, we've got to do something about actually closing that ratio. And that's a much longer-term question that's not going to be solved by Albanese's plan for 10,000 for the equity share, or Scott Morrison's plan for the 50,000 first home buyers.
What I was really struck by, looking at all the data on this and on housing in the area, mortgage stress obviously is strong when it comes to people who have mortgages. And we measure it by people paying more than 30% of their income on their mortgage. But people who are spending more than 30% of their income on accommodation are the renters. They are spending far higher percentages. So renters are actually in quite significant stress. Is anything being done, on that front, apart from a general discussion around supply, Peter?
Nothing I can detect, no.
Why not more, given what we've been talking about in this research? When it comes to the significance and the stress in marginal seats?
Well, part of it is that housing policy isn't actually a federal responsibility. I mean, they can run these programs and all the rest of it, but it's essentially a state function. Another part of it is that when, for example, Labor took a risk at the 2019 election and said, we're going to grandfather negative gearing on investment properties, it was a huge, the Liberal Party demonised them, and it turned into a huge problem for the Labor Party. So nobody's going to try anything risky, and that's a hallmark of this election, right? Is that the government is offering status quo, and Labor is offering status quo with a couple of extra talking points.
Speaking of talking points, the Prime Minister spent the morning campaigning not too far from where we are now in Parramatta. It's his 5th visit to the electorate. Up until now, the division has been represented by Labor MP Julie Owens, who's retiring after 17 years. Scott Morrison has spent time campaigning with local Liberal candidate Maria Kosovic, a co-founder of Western Sydney Women. Labor's candidate is economist Andrew Charlton, who was previously Senior Economics Advisor to Kevin Rudd. His pre-selection wasn't without controversy, with claims that he was parachuted into the seat at the expense of 2 local, diverse female candidates. So does this sound like a little bit of a familiar experience for you when you put your hand up, someone who's got a lot of roots in the community, you do a lot of work in, running domestic violence and legal aid clinics, and as a lawyer, when you were intending to run for the seat of Fowler for the ALP and Christina Keneally was parachuted in, who is not currently living in the electorate, did you see that as evidence of a broader problem?
Well, it definitely did feel a bit like deja vu. And yeah, it happened a couple of months ago. I think the federal election and campaigning is well on the way. I'm obviously not the candidate, so I would prefer that, the issue is not on me and on my personal experience. I think the positive that had come out from that is that it sparked a national public discourse around the issue of lack of diversity and underrepresentation in our federal parliament. And I think this was such a fantastic opportunity, even if it was a missed opportunity for me, but a fantastic opportunity for major parties and all parties to put up diverse candidates that were reflective or are reflective of the communities that they seek to represent.
Sorry to interrupt, but since the dispute about what happened to you, have they done that?
Well, clearly not when you look at the example in Parramatta that you just raised. So it felt like, we took 2 steps forward and 1 step back, which I think is another missed opportunity. And I think it just demonstrates that our major parties don't necessarily prioritise diversity, even though we talk about how important it is and the benefits. And we can see that with policy around having more women in Parliament as well, and the benefits of having more women who are in Parliament and who are making decisions about Australians and their lives. So I think that there's a long way to go. I think even in the Jenkins report there was a recommendation for a 10-year strategy. So it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's obviously not going to happen at this election for some of the very diverse seats in Western Sydney, but I think it's something that we need to be able to prioritise, and government needs to put this at the forefront for the future if we want greater diversity, not only gender but also racial diversity and ethnic diversity, and just more reflection of our communities, because we have very diverse communities, and unfortunately our parliament is very far behind compared to comparable countries.
Ned, I've got a feeling you've got strong views on this.
Yeah, indeed, and I think there's a broader message that is being sent with what happened to yourself too, and what's happened here in Parramatta. Ultimately, the parties are run by their constitutions, where when you imagine a new migrant and you say to them, come involved, get involved. We're a democratic nation, be involved in a political party, get involved in the community. And you do that, and then as a party member, you're entitled to a vote. To have the power structures, I call them in the East and the North Shore, where the power bases in Sydney say, no, well, we're not going to let the locals have a say. We will dictate to you what we're going to do, sends a very bad message to new Australians. And I think that in the seat of Fowler, it will be very interesting to watch. I don't think we're going to have a result on election night. So when we're going into a situation of a hung parliament, you've got Dai Lee, who's a local, the deputy mayor there. You have the Liberal candidate, and I think people are very upset about it.
But is the Liberal Party doing enough? We're talking about Labor candidates there. You brought up Dai Lee. She has been not selected for Liberal seats before. She's very popular now. She's running as an independent. Yeah,
and she's great, and it's a loss to the party, I would say. But this is where the reality is, the local members have to say, I'm the mayor because my local members had a chance to choose me to be the mayoral candidate. So that's a positive. But I think, parties have to say, you have to listen to your members, listen to your community. If you look at southwestern Sydney, look at both parties and look at the members of parliament who are there, it's the southwest Sydney being the most diverse part of the country, the parliament is the least diverse. And that needs to change, and it will change, and hopefully we'll see something interesting in Fowler. And Parramatta, I think, is going to be another one to watch as well. We want locals. Locals understand it. How can you fight for your community if it's not actually your community? It's got to come from your heart.
Give me some examples of that, like what it means to actually, I know and I understand this community in a way that someone else wouldn't. I know what it's like to live with this housing stress. I know what it's like to sit in a car for X, number of hours to get to work. What do you think is not properly understood about this region by those outside it? Yeah. So if you, for example, knowing, it's an amazing privilege when you're in elected office. Now sometimes you get hassled on 9:30 on a Saturday night when you're taking your family out because you've bumped into the local shopkeeper who's out there for dinner with his family, or you're visiting their restaurant and they're sharing you with those stories. You've got those local contacts. So when you're living and breathing the experience, what I call is the soul-destroying M5, which you're just spending an hour and a half every day getting to work and going back, and it's only getting worse. Right. You think, well, why aren't people actually seeing this, right? And you're only seeing it because when you're living and breathing, that's your reality. You've got examples like that, or whether it was lockdown. My LGA is 40 kilometres long. So when you implement a 5-kilometre rule, we had people who couldn't actually get anywhere to the shops. So they couldn't get to the shops. Right. So these are those sort of fundamental elements. And if we end up with Christina, who gets elected in Fowler, we know the community's not going to see her. If she's part of the government, she's not going to be around. But this is the question I want to ask you, Fran. I mean, the argument that's always put is that, but it's good to also have someone who's very senior within the party who can advocate for your community. I think Paul Keating called Christina Keneally like an executive candidate. Do you think that's true?
That she's an executive candidate?
Well, no, as in that there's merits to someone who might be very senior within the party getting a plum seat, and they can advocate for that community.
I mean, Clearly, the Labor Party wants Christina Keneally in the Labor Party. They want Andrew Charlton in the Labor Party. Are these people credentialed? Are they good for the job? Can they do it? The answer is yes. That is not, I think, the point of discussion here, right? The point of discussion for me is that you have this opportunity. Chris Hayes held, I just want to get this right, 12 years in the seat of Fowler was held by Chris Hayes. 17 years the seat of Parramatta, right? So these opportunities don't come up necessarily very often. We have these seats that I would argue are possibly the most multicultural seats in the country. They are now up for re-election. You have an opportunity to support a candidate that is from the community, that has the support of the outgoing member, and yet you choose not to.
What is it?
What is it? Do you just not care? Are you just talking the talk? Because I know that Labor does love to talk the talk on diversity, not just around women, but cultural diversity. I mean, my understanding is there was a conference in late last year in New South Wales where they agreed that there was an underrepresentation of diverse candidates within the Labor Party, within the upper echelons of power, and that they were going to do something about it. Well, this was your chance. And I feel as though I sit on, panels and diversity panels all the time, and panels about women all the time, and we tut and go, oh, but not enough diverse candidates run, isn't it terrible? Well, that's not true, because actually when they do run, it seemingly is the case that they are thwarted. So, it's really about locating opportunities and seizing on those opportunities.
And nurturing
and
people,
that's
yes.
the exact word that I was going to say after that. Really about nurturing those opportunities, because it is a slightly longer game.
Yeah.
So that's the more pertinent question for me, not whether Christina Keneally is an executive candidate or whether she can do for God's sake, of course she can do the job. She was the former state premier of New South Wales.
Right.
That's not what
but
we're
that
arguing
is constantly
here.
the defence that's put forward when we speak about it, which is why I bring it up.
Yeah, but I think it's a sort of a distraction from what I think is the key point here.
Peter, will this come back to bite the parties? There is again a significant gap between the rhetoric and the reality when it comes to something like diversity. And Tu is right. Like what happened with her, there was a huge debate across the country. A lot of people saying, I'm a leader in my local community, a lot of Victorians, and yet I just cannot get a look in from the major parties. Yeah. There's this real sense of frustration.
Yeah, I think it's a part of a broader syndrome of lack of respect and concern for your actual constituents. In the 1970s, as we know, the two major parties together had 90% of the primary vote. Now they're scratching to get to 70% between them of the primary vote. They were once mass parties with lots of members. Now they're these wafer-thin, relics of what parties used to be. One of the main reasons is this contempt for their communities, for their electorates. I mean, the Labor Party does it. There's a couple of good examples. Andrew Charlton is a bloke from Bellevue Hill, parachuted into Parramatta. Liberal Party does it as well. There was that enormous factional brawl in New South Wales division of the Liberal Party that paralysed their choice of a dozen candidates right up until the day the election was called. And they end up cancelling a planned local referenda, overriding local community, and Scott Morrison's captain's pick, Catherine Deeves, in the seat of Warringah, which has already come back to bite him. So I think these things do rebound on the political parties. They have a cumulative cost, the demonstrating contempt for local communities and running everything from headquarters. And then they can't really complain when the members stop showing up and people lose faith in the parties.
Tu, have you lost faith? Would you consider running again?
Well, I'm still a member of the Labor Party, and I mean, I don't know what the future's going to hold, but I don't think that after one attempt that it would be wise to give up. And I think it takes all of us to fight. And I don't think it's just about me or me personally that needs to run, but I think this had sparked in a lot of people, a desire to become more actively engaged. And to be more aware. A lot of people weren't even aware about politics, or didn't care to follow politics, but now they're very in tune with what's happening in the upcoming federal election. And I think that civic engagement in the process is only a good thing for the country, because people are then making an informed choice and they know who they're voting for. They're not voting habitually or because of how their parents had always voted for the past few decades. So I think it's a positive thing. Personally for me, I don't know what the future will hold, but I think if the opportunity comes up, anyone, I think, would want to be able to fight and as Ned said, when you are from the local area, you're heavily invested and your heart is there. And I think that's when you have the strongest candidate to be able to advocate for the issues that are relevant to the local community.
Ned, what do you think is going to drive the vote in this election? What do you think are the major issues concerning people in this region?
Yeah, look, cost of living is definitely one of them, and I think, as usual, it's like we're very lucky that we have a 4% unemployment rate. Out of the whole world, we are leading the way out of COVID. So I think people, once again, job security. It's very relevant. Who is going to invest in the infrastructure in our area, and who's going to keep the country safe? I think they're the main factors that people are thinking about.
Too.
I agree. I know housing stress, and I speak about it with all my friends and my peers and family. Everyone is feeling the pinch. A lot of people I know are working class, so living paycheck to paycheck is a reality. And so when cash rates increase, it has a real effect on their lives. I think too, and for me particularly, thinking about childcare costs and families and education for the future, I think is important as well. And people make decisions as to where they live based on these factors. And so I think it's really important that we know that government and parties are investing and looking to invest in communities. And unfortunately, the rhetoric is that safe seats don't get as much investment. So you see parties throwing money at marginal seats and building dog parks, which I never knew was a federal concern. But that's the case that we have now, because parties are fighting for these marginal seats. And unfortunately, other seats like those in southwest Sydney, who are safer seats for certain parties, are the ones that lose out.
All right, you are watching The Drum. With me on the panel, Liberal Mayor of Liverpool City Council, Ned Mannoun, journalist Fran, lawyer and Labor Party member Tu Lee, and political and international editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hartcher. The Prime Minister has faced continued questioning today over Australia's strained relationship with the Solomon Islands. He follows a tirade from the Pacific Islands leader in Parliament, in which he suggested Australia and its allies have been trying to undermine his government. He claimed there'd been threats of invasion if China established a military base on the Pacific Island.
We deplore the continual demonstration of lack of trust by the concerned parties and a touching warning of military intervention, Mr. Speaker, in Solomon Islands if their national and strategic interest is undermined in Solomon Islands. We are being treated as kindergarten students walking around with Colt 45s in our hands, and therefore we need to be supervised, Mr. Speaker. We are insulted.
But in a debate between the Defence Minister and the man who hopes to take his job, Peter Dutton was quick to dismiss the criticism.
I don't believe those criticisms were directed toward Australia, because the relationship we have with the Solomon Islands is an incredibly important one, and it'll continue to be so. The Prime Minister has literally, I know there's sort of this trendy sort of pile-on of Scott Morrison in different parts of the media and around the country at the moment, but Scott has gone out of his way to form those personal relationships at different fora through bilateral discussions, and he genuinely believes in the family of the Pacific.
The opposition, though, have continued their attack on the government, saying not enough was done to stop the security pact with China being signed.
Well, I think it's fair to say that Scott Morrison should have put in more effort. He should have made a phone call to the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands. He should explain to the Australian people what red line means. I think that's why you might be getting a response, or we are getting a response from the Solomon Islands after the rhetorical red line reference, which was never explained.
But despite remaining vague on when he last spoke to the Solomon Islands leader, Scott Morrison insists that Australia still remains the preferred security partner of the Pacific Island.
When did you last speak to him? Because according to previous stuff you've said it was at the end of last year or in the last few months?
I said I'd had contact with him in the last few months, and I have. Okay,
so how can you be assured then that we remain the preferred security partner if you haven't spoken to him in the last 4 weeks?
He's communicated that to me consistently. How? That is the policy. That is the policy of the Solomon Islands government. That is their policy.
Has he expressed that?
No, and he hasn't changed his policy.
Peter Hartcher, how significant do you think Mr Sogavare's outburst was?
Oh, it's pretty important in the story he's telling, the atmospherics he's building. The proposition itself that Australia is preparing to invade or threatening to invade Solomon Islands is ridiculous. Australia spent a decade and a lot of treasure, $2 billion, with the Ramsay mission to support law and order and restore democracy in the Solomons, and last year responded again to disturbances in the street with a security force at the request of the Solomons government, of Sogavare himself. But what Sogavare is now trying to do is he's telling the story where Australia is no longer the reassurance, it's the risk. Morrison did give him something to work with the, I think, ill-advised line about putting a Chinese military base in the Solomons would be a red line. What's the red line, Prime Minister? Are you going to invade? I mean, that's inviting that sort of...
What is it?
Yeah, he hasn't told us, right? So that sort of overheated rhetoric opens the door to Sogavare to build this story. And the story he's building is towards getting China as the new preferred supplier of security. China is clearly his personal choice. We know that the Chinese government, this is not corrupt or illegal, it's perfectly legal, but in their system, the Chinese government filled the funds into the so-called constituency funds that Prime Minister Sogavare himself used to pay roughly 40,000 Australian dollars each to every MP in the Solomons who voted to support Sogavare in a no-confidence motion at the end of last year. So where's the support coming from? What we fear, what many people in the community, the strategic and foreign policy community who watch this fear, is that Sogavare is building up to some sort of autocratic seizure of power to bring China in to protect his position, and maybe Chinese defence forces in as a personal Praetorian Guard to protect his personal political position as he tries to override a democratic parliament. There's already suggestions by Sogavare that the election due next year will have to be delayed because they're hosting the Pacific Games. The sporting event will preclude having an election, and it just so happens that the Chinese government is building that stadium, an enormous stadium in which the games are being held. So that's the sort of story he seems to be telling, and the trajectory that we fear he's heading towards.
And what of Mr Morrison's contact with him? I mean, what he was saying today is, I've had contact in the last few months. It's kind of vague. Is that enough?
It is pretty vague, and he has, on one point of clarity at least, told us that he hasn't spoken to Sogavare since the deal was announced between China and the Solomons. Is that enough? I think any reasonable person looking at this situation can see that this has been a conspicuous failure of Australian policy, that if you're failing with your current policy, you need a new policy. Asked what he would do differently, Scott Morrison has said, we'll continue doing the same things we're doing. So essentially we have a complacent policy, a failed policy, and an inert Prime Minister and Foreign Minister who've failed over the medium term to head this off, but then in the immediate crisis and wake of the revelation, have failed to act again. It really is just a failure all round. There's plenty of blame to share.
Jan, do you think people think much about foreign policy or influence much by foreign policy when it comes to voting in an election?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I actually had Kevin Rudd on my election podcast, and I was saying to him that one of the things that I don't particularly think about in prior elections has been foreign policy. Usually it's things like, it's cost of living, it's how the policies are going to impact your immediate life. I think on the question of whether Australians care about foreign policy, I feel this election has a point of difference. And the point of difference is that our relationship with China has been deteriorating significantly over the past 2 years. And I think Australians are increasingly aware of that. We've had a number of incidents where the rhetoric has been, really ramped up. They've put tariffs on Australian goods such as barley and wine. I know we had the incident where there was a doctored image or an artwork, call it what you will, that was shared on social media by a member of the Chinese Communist Party. that purported to show an Australian soldier slitting the throat of a young Afghan child. That really upset Scott Morrison. He demanded an apology from China. It did not come. So I think that there's been this awareness of rising tensions and rising escalations in the region between us and between China. And I think that there's been sufficient coverage of this deal with the Solomon Islands that I think voters will look at and understand has happened within that greater context. So I think if that deal had happened and we hadn't had the last 2 years, it may have appeared to kind of, slightly come out of nowhere or not be of particular concern in an election campaign, but it actually, there's a wider context here that I think voters are more acutely aware of this election than perhaps they were last.
And Sue, how do you think these debates are heard by, we've talked about how diverse this region is. There's a lot of Chinese immigrants, children of Chinese immigrants here. There's a lot of Vietnamese community. How do you think that they're received? Do you think the people are concerned?
I think particularly leading up to this federal election, people are concerned about it. And I think it's, as Jan said, there's a broader context to it. I think that whilst there are challenges with Australia's diplomatic relations with our Pacific partners and neighbours at this point in time, I think it speaks to a much broader issue of China's growing influence. And a lot of people in my local community, and they have ties to China and they have ties to the Uyghur community in China. And so I think the concern is the growing influence of an autocratic state. There are a lot of people who are directly impacted by their family and friends in Hong Kong, where there were threats to democracy in Hong Kong as well. So I think it's something, and I think there's been polls too around this issue and whether or not it's a big concern. And I think overwhelmingly people are concerned about foreign policy, whereas in the past, particularly for federal elections, it hasn't been the case.
What do you think on this, Nick? Because there's obviously a big Pacific community here as well, right? Yeah,
indeed, and I think this is a very serious issue, and we cannot underestimate this. And I think whether we're debating whether the Prime Minister, when did you call, when did you not call, this is significantly complex, and you can imagine what's happening at the moment. There's a recalibration with our policy, with not only with Australia, but with our AUKUS partners, with New Zealand, with America, because we are seeing what is a more assertive China in recent times, and hence why we're changing our position on that. But if this does not play out properly, this has significant consequences for our country. So I think there's I'm sure a lot being done behind the scenes that the Prime Minister can't go out there and say in a press release of what is going on or reveal all of our cards. Because
are you sure? I mean, he could at least say that he'd spoken to Minister Sogavare, which clearly he had. I mean, this is just baseline stuff that you should probably be doing at this point.
Well, the question is, what do you say to him? It's like, hey, what's this deal that you've done? We're not happy about it.
Yes. I mean, for starters.
Well, he got that message across. The message has gone across. The minister has gone out there and seen him. But where do we play and what do we do is about saying, we're going to give you a bunch more money so we can be friends again. China has been planning this for a significantly long amount of time, right? And they're a superpower. So they're out there doing something, and we haven't been necessarily privy to it, and we're much smaller than what they are.
But see, that's part of. Sorry, I feel like that is essentially part of the problem. Is that China has been investing very heavily in the Pacific for quite some time now, and it has not been a secret. I mean, it's been we've known that, and yet this deal seems to have sprung up out of the blue. We were caught completely unawares by it. That's a very big problem. And then in addition to that, we sent not our foreign minister, but we sent the Minister for the Pacific. So what does that tell us about the Morrison government's commitment to this issue?
Well, when you look at why is China doing this, they're not doing this to spread democracy in the world. Far from it. So we are bound by the principles that we work by as a democratic nation. If they want to go out there and set up a base,
but can we do diplomacy better? Can we be doing it better?
Oh, look, there's we as a Pacific family, I think this is the region that we need to be focusing on. Australia. Why are we going out there and participating in wars on other sides of the world where we need to be looking after our area? And as a Pacific family, I think Australia has a much greater role that actually can be played in there. And I think we have a great opportunity to do it from Western Sydney as well.
Yep. Peter, so today we had them there, both standing up there at the press club, the opposition, and Brendan O'Connor. We had Peter Dutton, the Defence Minister, saying answering questions, putting their cases. There was a lot of kind of argument, but really a lot of agreement. How did you rate what happened?
Well, they were both, in terms of the performance and the political back and forth, it was a pretty solid experience. There were no major dramas, no major news either. Although, to your question a minute ago to Ned and to Fran's point, Jan, sorry.
Don't worry, I've been called worse, Peter, it's okay.
Well, they're both lovely first names, so how could I resist? Brendan O'Connor, the Labor spokesman, did put emphasis on a lot more attention and money going to Australian diplomacy, which has got to be a pretty good investment when you're in a confrontation with a great power. But Labor is not offering any dramatically different ideas or dramatically different policies, and there is a reason for that. They're doing that pretty much across the board. I mean, there are some clear areas of difference: childcare policy, TAFE training, and so on. But on defence and the economy, they're offering slivers of difference, and the key reason is, well, two. First, to show that they're not radicals, don't be scared, safe change. Second, to keep the focus on Scott Morrison, which is where they want it to be. Labor wants this to be a referendum on Scott Morrison as a person, his character and his leadership. They don't want to get into policy debates, and they're not having them. Therefore, they're succeeding on that goal.
Today, yeah. Tick for the lack of debate in the debate. Okay, look, over the past 10 years, I want to talk about something else that's been happening in the past decade here, because around 80,000 refugees and asylum seekers have settled in Western Sydney. In fact, this area alone is home to a quarter of all Australian refugee arrivals. The return of the Taliban to Afghanistan last year brought a new wave of refugees to Australia, many of whom settled here in Western Sydney. Among them are 75 young Afghan refugees who recently began studying at Holroyd High School, not far from where we are. Many of them have engaged in a special English and acting program called Treehouse Theatre, aimed at raising their confidence. The Drum's Bethan Smolenick has the details.
Starting at a new school can be daunting at the best of times, and for many refugee students, like Lima and Mohammed, the memories of Afghanistan are still fresh.
That day, the Taliban camp, everything was so bad, you know. By no reason, they were just killing pupils, you know.
I'm feeling very, very safe here. No one is here to disturb me. No one is here to kill you.
To help refugee students cope with their trauma, teacher Ruth Hartcher O'Brien and counsellor Catherine Maguire-Don Vito launched Treehouse Theatre in 2010.
My name is Simon. I'm from Syria.
A lot of refugee kids have never seen a theatre before, don't know really what performance is about and what a stage is.
Desperation, fear for your children.
We teach them a lot of theatre skills and presentation skills.
The program, run out of 2 schools in Western Sydney, combines English lessons and drama classes, with students learning how to act out their own refugee story for a public performance.
They were even shooting the people.
At first, when I came to act what happened in Afghanistan, it was so hard for me to say something about my story. When Miss Catherine said, if you say that, you will be comfortable with that. And then when I said that, it was so good for me, because at the first, it was all of the things were mixed in my mind.
In the village. I think that sharing the story is the best way to forget the stress, to be confident and show the people about our life.
In this way, Treehouse Theatre acts as therapy for the students involved.
It's often the first time that they've told those stories to anyone, and sharing the story helps them to create a coherent narrative. It feels like then you're more in control of your thoughts and your feelings.
I can stop thinking about the past and I can control my emotions.
The students will take to the stage at Casula Powerhouse Arts Centre next month. It's hoped that their performances will shed light on what they've been through.
When we were in Afghanistan, there was a mask in our face. We were not laughing. That mask was laughing. And right now, they made us to laugh. We'll learn how to laugh inside.
Peter Hartcher, you're on the board of Treehouse. Your sister is obviously involved in it.
She's one of the crazy red hair.
Tell us what you've learnt from that.
Oh, well, I love those kids. That's for starters. And this has been running for more than 20 years in under different names, but the same two amazing founders and the same schools and the same group of kids, always refugees, with all of them with his tragic stories. They each have a tragic story to tell. But what it does for me, and I think for anybody who sees them perform, is it takes the abstract concept of a refugee, especially because they've been demonised in our political system for the last decade, and shows us the humans and tells us the stories and why they became refugees.
Yeah.
They didn't choose it. I mean, these kids have all gone through a traumatic experience, and yet the thing that always gets me is they have this tremendous, obviously they're incredibly resilient to get through and tell the tale, but they also have this optimism and positive energy. The performances themselves, I've seen them for many years, they're wonderful. They always bring a tear to my eye. And there are tragedies, and the kids tell these most heart-wrenching stories about their experiences. But they leaven it by telling funny stories about their childhood, usually before the trauma, then the horrible crisis that forces them to move. And then they give thanks for being in Australia and for all the opportunity and the safety, you've heard them talk about it, and the new life that they get, and they're so appreciative. And it just really, I think, makes the rest of us appreciate more what we have and what we should do more to improve.
Tu, what's it been like to grow up in an area which has such a wealth of refugees here?
Well, I'm constantly reminded by my parents and my community. Like in Vietnamese, we have a saying that when you drink the water, you'll always remember the source. So I'm constantly reminded how fortunate I am, particularly because when my parents arrived in Australia, we had quite an open and a much more compassionate refugee policy. And I reflect on if I was to arrive today and we had war in Vietnam, in recent years, that I'd probably be born in an offshore detention centre somewhere. So I think that my family and my community's personal refugee experience has really formed my view, and particularly now my view of our current policy, and also to how we welcome and how we treat recent refugees. And I think, unfortunately, it's a very human issue, but it's been treated as a political problem to be solved. That these are real people with stories of tragedy and trauma, and they've experienced so much in their life. And I know my parents, we consider ourselves to be very fortunate, and this is a lucky country. But I think that we have a long way, and I know where I live, it's fantastic that it's such a diverse community and it's very welcoming to refugees and migrants, newly arrived migrants. And I think it's a great thing, and I feel personally that I've benefited from being able to engage and connect with these types of individuals. So I think it's something that all Australians, because we've removed so much of the humanity from it, that we see it not as people's true stories and real stories, and opportunities like Treehouse and these types of initiatives are so amazing for people to be able to tell their own story in their own way, and be able to heal through that process, but also to be able to connect and share their experience with others. And I think as a country, if we're able to do more of that, I think it would enrich our lives as Australians.
And I'm so sorry, we've only got about 20 seconds left. But we're coming back to the question, Ed, of the strength of community and all the things we spoke about at the beginning of this program. Like, this is an economic powerhouse. There's a lot of opportunities here. Is this why refugees are coming to this region?
Look, they're coming here because I guess this is where the opportunity exists. It's in Western Sydney, it's in the southwest, and I think they add significant amounts of value to our country. And I look forward to the day that when we see the son or daughter of a refugee has either cured cancer at the Ingham Institute at Liverpool or has made a significant impact that's saved the world.
All right, great.
Watch this space.
Great note to end on there. Thanks so much to our panel. How awesome were they? Ned, Mannoun, Jan, Fran, Tu Lee and Peter Hartcher. You can have Ellen with you back tomorrow night. Hope you have an excellent evening. I'll see you very soon. Thanks for joining us tonight.